And on the other hand, no one in this hall, certainly, is going to tell Africa that they're going to have to grow, to industrialize with relatively expensive green power, that it will not be permitted to sell its hydrocarbons because of a mess that the rich world created. It's a very difficult debate, and one that we're lucky enough to have some key actors to help us with. Samaila Zubairu, the head of the Africa Finance Corporation. Guido Brusco, the COO of Natural Resources at the Italian supermajor Eni. I'd like you to give these gentlemen a round of applause. Samaila, let's talk about this word, or these words, just transition, because it occasionally sounds like anyway that the word just is elided and ignored, and it's, you know, just transition already, Africa, and rather than taking time to understand that there is a real equity issue here. How can we help people understand this? There are huge communication efforts needed, I believe. And has this idea of gas as a transition fuel really been accepted, or will Africa struggle now to find financing for gas projects?
Thank you very much. Very interesting question and topic. I think very important for all of us globally. And I think I like the way you framed it. You know, it's very important for us to get context and to understand the issues. So the first thing is, you know, for Africans, you know, a transition is really not the subject for us. It's really about energy access for most of Africans. And energy access in a way that is very unusual. And I say that because we have, you know, over half the continent, you know, and then now maybe people say about 40% without access to electricity at all. You know, we have about 970 million people, you know, without access to any clean cooking methods. You know, and we have, you know, really about 18% of the world's population currently using just about 6% of the world's energy. And that is why, you know, we have 3% of the energy-related carbon emissions globally. So while we are the least responsible for global warming or climate change, as it were, you know, we are the most impacted. And he mentioned, you know, already we have climate refugees, and it's going to grow. We have significant loss in food production. You know, it is projected that, you know, certain parts of Africa, you know, will have GDP contraction by up to 8%. You know, so I mean, there are a lot of issues for us as Africans, you know, with climate change and the need for a transition. So, but for us, you know, it's really about access. And it's important that we understand this access story so that we know that transition is really about how can we have, you know, more people have just basic cooking in a way that we can also save the planet, because we know that what works today for carbon capture, you know, are the forests. That's what we know that works. You know, there are several plans and several, you know, ideas on how to change that, but it's all still on the drawing board. What works today is the forest, and the forest is fast depleting because that's what we use mainly to cook. Now, we know that we have about 5,000 billion cubic meters of gas that has been recently discovered that has not been developed, and is not likely going to be developed because of lack of access to financing. We know that Africa has to industrialize, and Africa also is going to require more energy as we grow. We're projected to be over 2 billion people soon, and that means a lot more energy consumption on the continent. So as we grow, we're going to need more energy. And we indeed have several sources, and we can take a different path from the rest of the world. And I say that because Africa has 60% of the best solar sources. So we can indeed have energy access in a renewable way. We have significant hydro potential. We have significant wind potential. So we have all of these potentials, and it's possible for us to improve access for Africans. And there have been several studies that show what a sustainable Africa scenario looks like. And it shows that with the right amount of investment, in fact, the investment, is just arguably $25 billion per year. $25 billion is about 1% of what is spent globally on energy today. Now, that can give more Africans access. So the concept of a just transition or a fair transition has to be one in which Africans have access to affordable energy as a major priority. We have more Africans that have access to safe cooking methods. We have more Africans connected to grids, mini grids, and solar-powered grids as well. And we have more Africans engaged in industrial activity. We have more African gas that is produced because we know that even producing the additional gas that's required is not going to change the emissions. I mean, all the studies show that if we produce our natural gas, we're going to increase emissions by just 0.5%. Just 0.5%. So that means that we still have significant scope for us to develop. We have significant scope to industrialize, and we should industrialize. And more importantly, as the world transitions, they're going to require a lot of minerals and metals that are already in Africa. And it can't be that we are working with the current supply chain architecture whereby we're exporting most of these minerals and metals from one part of the world to another part of the world, embarking on several thousand kilometers of voyages that are highly polluting, and then to the rest of the world. It makes sense for Africa to be at the center of the value addition that takes place for the cobalt, copper, nickel, lithium that are required for batteries. It makes sense for Africa to produce the solar panels that are required to power the continent. It makes sense for all of this activity to take place. And we, as the Africa Finance Corporation, are making, the right headway, in our own little way. We are building manganese smelters. We're building industrial parks that would house production of solar PVs. We're embarking on several activities that would add more value to the continent so that we have the stock of goods and the stock of energy materials for the transition.
Thank you. Guido, there's increasing pressure on oil producers to stop pumping the oil, and even pressure being applied on financing of gas projects. Obviously, if oil producers were forced to stop, then that might force states to replace these sources of energy. But it also looks like it's putting the cart before the horse. Shouldn't we as a society come up with new forms of cheap green energy to just naturally displace oil and gas because it's cheaper? How do any shareholders think about these risks to the business model? How are you hedging against it? And are you expecting stranded assets on the continent because of this pressure?
Well, a short answer is no. We are not expecting stranded asset for a reason. So at one point in time, fossil fuel will be phased out. But I mean, we made this mistake in the past year when we reduced significantly the investment in oil and gas, and the combination of the shortage of investment and the Russia and Ukraine crisis brought the world in a very bad place, and it showed how fragile was the supply chain for the energy. So when I think about what Zubairu said about the just transition, and perhaps my scientific background can help me, because I was in a university a few days ago, and when I was asked what is a just transition, it's just a combination of two elements: is decarbonization and an inclusive development. So indeed, we have to fight the energy poverty. We have to provide the essential rights, access to energy, education, health, but also we shall have a structured and unbiased, I would like to underline, unbiased approach to the energy transition, particularly for what relates the technology. There is no one solution that fits all. And a jump from the current mix to totally renewable it's just not possible. Every energy every new source of energy has been incremental along the course of the history. We started with the biomasses, then we moved to the coal, then to the liquids, to the gas, to the renewables, to the nuclear, fourth generation, then cold fusion. So none of them has replaced the other. They've all been incremental. And if I look at the statistics in Africa, 35% of the energy is produced with biomasses, 35% with the oil and gas, and 15% with coal, and 15% with the renewables. So it's a long journey. We have to be careful. We have to be balanced. We have to provide to the people the cheapest energy to allow the economy to grow. And it's always a balance between the right to develop the economy and the need to reduce the emissions. But first and foremost, we shall not be biased by any technologies. This is a technological process. This is a technological journey. And my plea to the policymakers is to consider that in their...
Fantastic. Thank you. Samaila, sometimes it can feel like the penny's dropped, that a plurality of rich nations want to finance an alternative. We've seen attempts in South Africa with the JET program to replace coal, which I don't think is moving very fast. But even though there are these green billions promised, sometimes it feels there's not always the instruments available to link that investment desire to opportunities on the continent. How can we turn that around? How can we turn the billions into trillions, as you've spoken about before?
Very good question, and that's really the key challenge for most of Africa. And I want us to understand that, while we're talking about energy, it's just one of the SDGs, a bigger problem for us in Africa is actually tackling poverty. And that seems to have, dropped off the radar. So financing, access to finance is one of the biggest challenges that we have. And I think that, the solutions are also with us. We just need to be a bit more ambitious, and we need to take more responsibility and more ownership of the issue. And I think that if we have, very clearly articulated development plans that include energy industrialization, and we demonstrate that we are willing to make the necessary investments, to de-risk the opportunity. And then we can see that financial flows can come on top of that. I say that because, we must first take ownership as Africans that the responsibility to develop our continents is ours, and we must step up to do that, and then the world can follow. We can't just expect the billions to flow in. We must first take the initial steps. And those initial steps are first articulating the challenge, showing a path for us to execute, start the execution, and then the world will follow. So we can start by institutions like ourselves. African governments need to understand that they need to fund African institutions. We need to increase the amount of domestic savings that are available, because you can't just work with international capital. We need local capital working on the continent. And we need to find the frameworks that de-risk for local capital to work. We need to find the frameworks that allow for local capital to provide the long duration funds that are required. We need to find structures that allow local equity capital markets to be sustainable. And we need to put in place all of those structures. Multilaterals like ourselves can help with providing the development capital that is required. We can help with providing the concession finance that is required, that you can layer on private sector capital on top of it. So again, we need to just ask ourselves, where are the pools of capital that we have today? And where are those capitals located? How can we get more of that to work locally? How can we get our pension funds, our insurance companies to play more in the local market. At the Africa Finance Corporation, together with the NSIA, we have a pilot project in Nigeria called InfraCredit, where we're trying to see how we can mobilize long-term funds to invest in infrastructure. We are trying to extend that program through a larger project called the Infrastructure Corporation of Nigeria, and we think that that can be replicated across several other African countries. So we need to find a framework for first having local capital work in the country using blended finance. We need to have more African countries understand that their foreign reserves really don't make sense if it's just all outside the continent. Part of that money has to stay on the continent, and you need to find a framework for that money to be in the continent, working for the economy. More importantly, we need to have more structural transformation taking place on the continent. I say that because not until or not unless we start transforming from raw materials to semi-finished goods and finished goods, we would not have value capture. With enhanced value capture comes with stronger financial institutions and stronger GDP, bigger GDP. So just imagine this morning the Prime Minister of Cote d'Ivoire was talking about, all African countries, or all cocoa producers having just 7% of the value of a $140 billion industry. And that moving from about 7% that they are today to 30% is going to increase GDP by 75%. So imagine what impact that will have across various other African countries, what impact that will have across capital markets, financial markets across the continent. So those are the things that we need to focus on. We need to focus on structural transformation. We need to focus on enhancing local financial institutions.
So
if I may, on I'm looking, of course, from the perspective of an energy company like my company that delivers almost 90% of its gas production to the hosting countries and produce electricity in the countries, in Nigeria, in Congo, and other countries. We also produce electricity, and the sector that lacks the most the investment is the infrastructure. So one of the biggest problems we have is to deliver the reliable energy, cheap and reliable, because the electricity we produce with the domestic gas is the cheapest. But unfortunately, we are not able to deliver this energy because of the lack of the infrastructure, and people are obliged to use more polluting and expensive energies. So this is one of the sector where you can really make the difference as a financial institution.
And we were talking about the incremental nature. It's not one or the other. Africa needs lots of energy from lots of different sources. Are biofuels an option? What needs to be developed on the continent?
Well, I think on the biofuels, Africa has a competitive advantage for reasons that are very clear. So there's a lot of land. There is sun. There are the conditions to produce first and foremost and develop the agriculture for food. Because what I want to make clear is that the agriculture for biofuels will just use the degraded and marginal lands, which are not used for agriculture at the moment. So upgrading also the soil. Indeed, there is a great potential. As a company, we have quite challenging targets to bring over than 700,000 tons per year by the 2026, with a business model which is very simple and which provides jobs, reliable revenues for farmers, and also is in line with the transition. And just a week ago, we fueled the first African flight with biofuels from Kenya. And just before this panel, I was announcing that our dream or ambition would be also to fuel a flight, not just one, but a number of flights from this country with biofuels. And in Ivory Coast, and this is not just coming from the primary agriculture, but also for the resids of the supply chain. agriculture. For instance, we will use wastes here in Ivory Coast to squeeze those wastes, produce vegetable oil, and then bring it to our biorefineries to produce fuel oil. And this is the primary fuel to decarbonize some transportation sectors like the heavy trucks and the airplane, which wouldn't be possible in a short and medium term with other energy resources. So to answer your question, yes, there are opportunities, and it's also very labor intensive and could, in a sector like ours, which is
12 finances Africa's green power alternatives. That's extremely powerful leverage. How can we get that across in global fora? And what would a more green version of industrialization look like? We've just had a clue there from Guido, but Samaila.
I mean, I don't know how to respond to this question. I think I'll just do it from an optimistic way. You know, I mean, the reality is there's just so much talk, you know, and no action. That's just really the reality. You know, we just keep hearing all these words, you know, about what needs to happen, you know, and nothing is happening. Again, for me, because it's the one planet that we all have, and it's because we all must take responsibility, you know, to save the planet, we need to focus on what we need to do. You know, and again, for us in Africa, what we need to do is first have a clear path for our development. We must try to be as energy efficient as possible. So where we can develop, you know, renewable, let's develop renewable. Where we must develop natural gas, as we must to industrialize, then we need to do it. As we develop natural gas, let's try to see how we can reduce emissions from methane and generally reduce emissions. You know, let's try to be efficient. So, for example, we need to have standards that avoid importation of, you know, heavy energy users, like second-hand cars. You know, so we need to have investments in proper transport networks. So we don't need to have a lot of those second-hand cars. We need to use LED lights when we can. You know, so generally we need to focus on what we need to do. Now, we have done a lot of all the structures that are required to mobilize the funding. Again, as Africans, let's take the initiative and let's make the investments to build our continent. Let's highlight the need for voluntary carbon markets to really take root. Let's highlight the, I would say, inconsistencies and contradictions of additionality. You know, let's make it known that right now, the framework we have for voluntary carbon markets or carbon markets is that there's an incentive for growing a tree, but there's no incentive, you know, for keeping the tree alive. So it's okay for you to build new trees and you get compensated for that, but for the trees that already exist and are absorbing the carbons, get no credit. So we need to highlight the irrationality of such things, you know, for the world to, and then let everybody decide. You know, we need to focus on how we can, you know, develop our people, make development about people, make it about how Africans take responsibility for the energy transition, make it about the choices we make, you know, of using less polluting fuels when we can, growing responsibly. So that's really about our choice. And let's choose to build a better continent for future generations of Africans.
Thank you. Guido, final thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I cannot disagree on I mean, less talk, and we should walk more our talks. And I'll give you just an example of what we are doing here in Ivory Coast. Now, so we are developing a gas, an oil project with gas. We are delivering the gas to the domestic market and allowing to produce energy and to boost the economy. But we are also doing business on biofuels. We are also looking at the renewables. We are also improving the quality of the education for our interest also, because we need the right human capital to develop. So this is really what we need. We need to start from concrete and basic. Let's be more pragmatic in our approach. And this is what we are doing in many other countries other than Ivory Coast. We are doing the same in Congo, in Kenya, in Angola. And I'll tell you, this approach is rewarding in the long term. When we were in the middle of the crisis in March with Russian cutting gas to Europe and Italy particularly, and when we went to our neighbored countries in North Africa, which were linked to us with pipelines, asking for more gas, this gas came. And this gas came because we invested in those countries. We delivered the gas to the domestic. We helped their economy to grow. So this approach that was looking at the need of the country was really rewarding. It's a drop in the ocean. Yes, it's a drop in the ocean. But if more drops will come from other companies, from other energy companies, I've heard a lot looking of LNG, export LNG. Let's develop first the domestic market, and then we look at the LNG. This is a just transition. Otherwise, we just talk.
Absolutely. Ladies and gentlemen, our panel, thank you. Very interesting discussion, and you will be able to catch up with them later on in the day. I know you all have lunches to go to, so thanks for your forbearance, but it's a very, very important discussion. Again, a round of applause for our panel. Thank you very much.